So at the age of 12, he and I were going off all over England on our bikes and staying at youth hostels and things. And never thought twice about that. I mean, my family didn't have a phone, so I couldn't ring them up. I might send them a postcard from South Wales or something. There's the war going on, you know, the world's there, things are happening. And you start thinking about things like that. I mean, you even start thinking about death, because you might die that night, you know. Because I was engaged in political thought and some political activity, even at school, but certainly in university, and had read the kinds of books by Bernal about the social function of science and things. I was and because of my class background and my general left-wing politics, the practical application of science was very important. Ordinary people, coming out of the forces, and us we in university, were determined that there should be a better world. It's been now through 4 editions, and it's still a new version printed a couple of years ago, and it's probably... It's said to be the most cited book ever, or paper ever published in fisheries science, and that's nice to know. We didn't intend it to be that way. So we invented new methods, and we did the analysis, and we produced an interim report before the end of the year saying, you may think you've got to reduce the quota a bit, but you've got to cut it dramatically, right? Not 16,000 cutting to 15 or 14,000. You've got to cut it down to 4,000, which was, you know, was absolutely untenable as far as the whalers were concerned. So I've been introduced to another way of looking at whales, of studying whales, and so on. Far cry from from population dynamics and the IWC's approach, science I've been doing. So I've been kind of inoculated with that. Then went to 74 to this fantastic gathering. And from then onwards, it seemed to me, it took a while to get round to this, but it seemed to me the thing to do is to stop whaling. Just amazed at how much luck there's been, and the people I've met and the steps that I've taken have happened to me. I never seem to have a clear direction. Things just happen, and I let them happen. I suppose that's one of the things. Yeah, my name's Sidney Holt. Joseph is the middle. That was my granddad. Sidney, because that was my father. And I was born in the East End of London. I'm a Cockney, as we call ourselves. And my mum and dad were East Enders, working class people. But then we moved when I was about 4. I was born in 1926. I was 4. We moved out to a new suburb in northwest London because they wanted me to have a better life. But they got me. I was a young child, their only child, and they wanted me to grow up here where the air was clean and the country a bit and so on. So we were right on the edge of London. Could go straight into London very easily, but at the same time, half a mile further out, I was out in open country at that time. The suburbs were just expanding. And so I grew up there and went to a local school in a little place called Hendon, Colindale it was called. But this was the 30s. My father was unemployed, almost all the 30s, or half employed, so I knew what it was like to go with him to the Labour Exchange and collect the dole and things like that. I mean, we weren't hungry or anything, reasonably comfortable, but we had a house, which most people didn't do, and a garden, which was important. My dad was a real Cockney. I think my mother's family came from the country, came from Essex, and then they met they met after the First World War in the East End of London, in Stratford. I think they were special. They were very ordinary. We didn't have many books in the house or anything like that, but they were not. They were sort of good working class people, right? They didn't drink. They weren't teetotal, but they didn't drink. They didn't go out pubbing and beer and all that kind of thing. And they're what we call respectable working class people. And my my father was sort of spoke real Cockney all the time, and my mother was always trying to improve him. My mum had always got this idea, we'd be a bit more respectful, speak proper like, And I was an adult before I knew that couples actually quarrelled. I never ever saw parents exchange a crossword with each other. They possibly did, but always out of hearing of me, So I grew up in this kind of rather protected atmosphere, really. And I was an only child. I had friends around. I didn't have sisters and and brothers to bully me or for me to bully or anything like that. So when I was 11, I did what everybody in Britain did at that time, took my 11+ exams, which determined what kind of secondary education I would get. You'd either go to a kind of technical college, you stayed on to work after from 11 to 14 or 16, whatever it was, or go to something what we call a secondary school, more like a grammar school, and more academic kind of education. And I was sick and I couldn't take the 11+ exams. And in those days, if you missed your 11+ and didn't pass it, you'd had it, You had no second chances or anything. But luckily, because I was good at taking tests and things, my teachers put me into a special exam for a scholarship at a public school. Public school, that's a private school in England, right? That happened to be nearby, a few miles away from my home. It was one of the company schools, livery companies, of which there were several in London. And they nearly all started schools, grammar schools sort of thing, in the boys' schools mostly, in the 17th century, or some of them even earlier. Mine was, I think, early 17th century, haberdashers it was called. And so I took the scholarship exam for this, and I passed it. Six scholars every year, and so that saved me. So I went off to public school. My mum and dad just wanted me to be happy and have a good education. The whole thing was, I'd have a good education, have a better life than them, right? One of the things about growing up in those years in a city like London was young people were incredibly free. I mean, by the time I was 12, I think my first year at public school, with a friend, a Welsh friend, who was my first friend there, he was another scholarship boy, another clever cock, we mated up, and we used to go off bicycling. So at the age of 12, he and I were going off all over England on our bikes and staying at youth hostels and things, and never thought twice about that. I mean, my family didn't have a phone, so I couldn't ring them up. I might send them a postcard from South Wales or something. So anyway, I started the haberdashers' school. Just before the war, I think I must have had to, I remember when I was 11, must have gone in 1937. And so I was 2 years before the war broke out. And those were fairly strange. It was an interesting school because it was in an area of London, in Hampstead, where there was a very big Jewish population, mostly middle class, or stockbrokers and so on. And so I grew up in a school with a lot of Protestant kids and quite a lot of Jewish boys. That meant that although we had Church of England associations with the school. In fact, the headmaster, was a divine, a doctor of divinity at the time, but he went under great pressure because the Jewish boys were all led off prayers and things anyway. They were doing their own thing. So it was kind of very free in that way. So for the first 2 years, I was just trying to learn to adapt to live in this different environment. And of course, I very quickly became a sort of adopted middle class and began to distance myself from my mum and dad. I loved them, but I began to be different and have different interests. And it was a very extraordinary school, and it still is, because it's one of the few public schools, I think, which combines in a nice way science, and very strong on science, quite strong on the arts, but especially music, and in sport. And very often it's, one or the other. And as I was good at athletics, I fitted well. I did well because I could also run and I could play rugby and things like that. Those 2 years were kind of in the junior forms adapting. And then came the war. Nothing much happened in the historical sense, but things were happening in the sense that there was a blackout, so you couldn't go out, didn't have lights on. We were already rationed for food right from the beginning. There were 1 or 2 false air raid alarms, and then it was quiet, but meanwhile things were going on in Europe, but we weren't, and even Dunkirk and all that kind of thing going on. But if you were young and weren't involved, and my dad was already past call-up age. He turned over from being a joiner smoking pipes to making munitions and things. Worked a lathe. But meanwhile, we were beginning to have to do not military service, but military training in school. And in fact, when I went to university, I had to do quite a lot of military stuff while I was during the war still. But then they bombed the big blitz on the docks of London, and so we were outside that. We only began to get real bombing where I lived later on, when the rockets and the buzz bombs, as we call them, the V1s, started coming, and they would come as far as us. We lived right near us was one of the main RAF aerodromes. But it was a small one from the First World War. It was actually an RAF headquarters, but it was too small for Spitfires and so on to take, when they were all merely down in the south of England or on the east in East Anglia. But we were a target still, nevertheless, because it was a headquarters area. But they only got that later on. That was where it started. The bombing of London and the London docks didn't really reach North London. And so I used to have to go into school twice a week and fire watch, as we called it, to put out incendiary bombs if they fell on the school and things like that. When the more senior boys, we used to go and sleep outside on the rugby pitch and watch the fireworks going on, the anti-aircraft shells. It was rather stupid because there was shrapnel falling around. But still, it was great. It was nice lying on a camp bed and watching all this stuff going on. And then one night the school was bombed. I wasn't there, but they hit a wing of the school and destroyed the new science building. After the bombing, they decided the school would move out we owned land outside London, further north even than I lived, but not that far from a place called Mill Hill, with football pitches and things, and an old game lodge which was used for changing rooms and things like that. So the school actually decided to move out there, and it was partly because of the bombing, but it was also because it was also beginning to get dangerous. So we were expected to go to school half-time in a playing field place and then go home and study the other half of the day. And we had to reduce curriculum, so we had to make some choices. And you had to choose between history and geography. I chose history. Then I had to choose between science and practical things like woodwork, and I chose woodwork. But my best friend, my Welsh friend, went over we went, go this side of the room if you want to be a scientist, go over there if you want to be a carpenter, sort of thing. And my best friend went over to be a scientist, and so I crossed, at the very last minute I crossed and I'm going to be a scientist, and joined him. It was only because he was there. I was much more interested, really. I liked mechanical things. I was always doing things. I was building illegal radio transmitters and constructing things all the time. But science as such, I didn't really know what that was. I knew what kind of engineering was about, And so I was doing woodwork. It's a practical thing, learn how to use tools. But anyway, I went over, became a scientist, gave up carpentry. Anyway, I drifted into biology. I got interested in biology right in the sixth form, in my last years at school. I was never much of a naturalist, but I sort of, I read about evolution. And I was reading quite a few of the popular scientists of the time, and did that much more later. They were reading of people like Joseph Needham and R.G. Bernal and J.P.S. Holt. These were very, very important to me. I was a single child, and I was reading all the time, even though I had friends. And so I began to read about evolution. By the time I was 13, I was already an atheist anyway. I was confirmed into the Church of England, because I more or less had to be, and I thought it'd be like what it was. My parents sent me to the local congregational church, which is a non-conformist, easygoing church, mostly so they could have sort of sleep on Sunday afternoons and things. And so I learned a little bit about Jesus and Christianity and stuff. It wasn't heavy duty. Haberdashers, it was heavy duty in the sense that I had to be confirmed. But I think the day after I was confirmed in the Church of England, I announced that I was an atheist. And one of this, I was an agnostic then, and I became an atheist later on. So I was going through all this. And of course, at that time, the boys around it, there's the war going on, you know, the world's there, things are happening. And you start thinking about things like that. I mean, you even start thinking about death, because you might die that night, you know. So you sort of think about things like religion, but probably more than most people that age do. And by the time I'd read some J.B.S. Haldane on evolution and decided I was not a Christian anymore, and we weren't pressed into it. I mean, I did my stuff in the school, but no one was going to... I still have to go to prayers in the morning, but no, not much, 5 minutes, sort of, so thank you for our food sort of thing. So then where are we then? We're ready to go to university. And the problem, so in the middle of the war still. Problem then, what should I do? I wanted to be by then I was fairly interested in biology. I'd had to practice, I didn't do much maths, which I had to learn my mathematics later when I was already starting to do research. I'll tell you about that. But so physics was going to be a bit of a problem. So I did concentrate on biology. I decided to go to university and do biology, and I did zoology and botany too. I had to do 3 subjects, and the third one was going to be one that would stop me getting called up into the forces. As you're a young man, you were already 17. I was 17, and I was just ready to be called up. So I did chemistry. And that kept me out of the forces temporarily, because chemistry, physics, and maths were 3 subjects that gave you exemption from the draft. So that's how I came to do some chemistry, which was, I said, I thought it was really boring, but I had to do it. And went to the University of Reading, which was what we call Red Brick University, which had started as an extramural college of Oxford, but was now a small university 30 miles west of London. And there's basically an agricultural university. And doing dairying and things. And nearly all the students were girls, but I was frightened of girls terribly. I was terribly shy. So I didn't really get much advantage from that. And the only boys there were the ones who were studying physics or chemistry and getting free of the draft. So I was the only, for example, I was the only student of biology in the entire class of the only male, and all the rest were girls. But so it was a rather strange university. It was a very small university. I think there were only about 1,000, 1,500 students there. But it was very good, and it was very good in biology because of the agriculture and so on. And then I had to do sort of more active military stuff and learn how to fire a machine gun and things like that. Clean brass buttons, polish my boots. I was a bit of a rebel, as was my friend Phil. We both, with a Welsh friend, we resisted doing what we considered to be stupid things during our military education. You know, they were still making you polish brass buttons on your uniform and have shiny boots and things. And I said I didn't want to wear my uniform, it made me itch. And we were really bolshists and didn't see why we should wear school caps when we were outside school and all sorts of stuff like this. Got me in trouble. I was told, you will never be a prefect, Sidney. So that's all right with me. I don't want to be a prefect and beat the other boys. They still had some physical punishment there, but not like the big schools like Eton and Winchester and things like that. We were fairly liberal there. And that continued in university. So in university, I met the third one of the three friends, Peter Jewell, and we shared a room together in college, and he was doing agricultural botany at the time, I think. But he was already pretty well far on the left. He was already engaged a bit in politics. He's a year older than me, but he got in rather early. He did a very different family life, a middle-class bloke, but very, very intense. But anyway, we became extremely good friends, and he became president of the union. I became vice president. So we were both very active in union politics. And of course, at that time, especially towards the end of the war, ordinary people in Britain, especially in places like the 8th Army in North Africa and so on, were very politicised, right? The 8th Army used to be called the Red Army, and they were sort of studying politics in between going out to battle, that kind of thing. And this was reflected a bit in the universities among the young. You have to understand that England and that Britain at that time, ordinary people, coming out of the forces and us we in university were determined that there should be a better world. This was a kind of a revolutionary period that was in. So Winston Churchill, who had been everybody respected, led the war and kept our spirits up against the Germans and all that kind of thing, but he lost the post-war election, right? Because people wanted something different from the old Conservative Party. So it was a remarkable thing. Here was our war hero, but he was thrown out as soon as there was an election. And in fact, my friend Peter, the third person in my group of old friends, he was a member of the Communist Party already, and he got me into the Communist Party. But again, I was kind of number two. I mean, for the post-war election that brought the Labour government into power and brought the National Health Service and all these big changes in Britain at that time, he was going out on straight corners, standing on a soapbox, and sort of in support of either the Labour government candidate or the Communist candidate. And I sort of carried his soapbox for him. Never did he talk, he was there pounding away, and I was the one who'd stand there and start asking loud questions so it would attract a crowd. You know, if you're doing a soapbox, then you have someone who's going to start heckling you, and then everybody's coming in and listening. So I was that was my role in the post-war election. The basic courses then were in 2 years to your first degree, and then I stayed on for a third year and specialised in zoology. And it was going into that where some choices had to be made. You know, what am I doing this for? What sort of job am I going to have? I didn't want to be a doctor. I wanted to be a vet. But to be a veterinary surgeon, you had to do 7 years training. And my parents could never have accepted 7 years. I mean, I was living on a small scholarship. They had absolutely no money. They had a bit more during the war than before it, because my dad, people were working during the war. But still, they didn't have any money, and they certainly couldn't have kept me on for another 5 years. And but I talked to the professor of zoology there, a bloke who'd been in Charles Donahue. He'd been in Canada. I think he was Scottish, I think. But he'd been in Canada and worked in St Andrews on the east coast as a young man studying fish. And he said, well, why don't you sort of study fish? There's some jobs in fisheries and things like that. And so I made the decision that I would, in my last year, I would become a fish person, and I chose a species of freshwater fish called the tench, and that was my fish then. And so I did my year on this, thinking about what I was going to do. And he organised, when I got my degree, my honours degree, it was my second degree, and I was still only, I think when I got that I was still only 18. I mean, I was finishing university at the time, and most people are just going to get going there. Right? I was introduced to two men in Whitehall. We sat in a room about as big as that cupboard there, and he talked to me about fisheries. And one of them was a man named E.S. Russell, who had been the director of the laboratory before the war, a laboratory of fisheries in Lowestoft in East Anglia, big fishing port. And the other was the man who had just been appointed as the new director. He's slightly younger man named Michael Graham. And they interviewed me and asked me about things and said, did I know any mathematics? And I said, really not very much. I had to give it up. And they said, were you prepared to learn it? I said, yeah, I'll learn mathematics if I have to. And so you'd have to do that, if you come and work on fisheries, because fishing research is, as in Michael Graham talking particularly, fisheries research is a form of operations research. You know what operations research was? I said, yeah, I'd heard about it. And the way the boffins went into the forces and showed the generals how they should really distribute their bombs and things. So I knew a bit about that. I'd read a lot about it. And some of the people who were in operations research, I'd read all this. I was sort of very keen on these scientists who were trying to popularise things. One was Blackett, who was, I think, science advisor to the Ministry of War and so on. So I knew a bit about that. I understood what they were talking about, which was important because that's what it was about. It was going into something which, or perhaps I should say, because I was engaged in political thought and some political activity, even at school, but certainly in university, and had read the kinds of books by Bernal about the social function of science and things. I was very, and because of my class background and my general left-wing politics, and so we talked about this, and then they said, well, you can have a job in Lowestoft. And the first day I was there, I went to sea with the director. If I'd never been on a ship before, I went to sea on a trawler. That was an experience. But the fisheries researchers there, and especially Graham's influence, meant that we were closely associated with the industry. We weren't working for the industry, but we still go out on fishing boats and be friends with the fishermen and go in the pub with them and got back, that kind of thing. And but Graham was able to do that, but he came from an upper middle class family in the north, a Quaker family, landowners and things. His whole background was kind of Fabian socialist sort of thing, as many of the Quakers were, like the Cadburys and Rowntree's families that were around the chocolate industry. So he had written a book before the war, and the first thing he did was tell me I'd got to read it, called The Fish Gate. It was published during the war, but he'd written most of it. And it was about overfishing, taking too much fish, not leaving enough to grow up and catch next year, sort of thing. And his attitude was, we've got to have a regulated fishing. But in fact, he had quite a lot of aphorisms that I know now very well. And one of them was that unregulated fisheries become unprofitable. That was one of the headings of a chapter in the book, The Fish Gate. And it was really about saving the fish so that the fishermen have a fishing industry, so that the fishermen were all right next year and 10 years' time, right? It wasn't to save the fish, but you have to save the fish so that you have the fishermen. And because of the times we were living in, of social interest relationships in the new world, so what's good for the fishermen will be good for the country. We can all go and still eat our fish and chips. And so in the 30s, he had been a young researcher and had seen the decline of some of the trawl fisheries in the North Sea and written this wonderful book. It's still a wonderful book for me. I've read it 2 or 3 times in the last few years because it's got everything. It's got everything. It's written by a man with culture who's got science, but he knows what he's took what he wants out of society and things like that. And he'd been brought up in the Quaker tradition. It's a marvellous book. Well, the Fish Gate is one of the gates of Jerusalem. And of course, the Quakers and those kinds of religiosi, as we call them in Italian, were very much into Jerusalem. You know, after the Great Fire of London, the Protestant elite of Christopher Wren and the Royal Society people and so on wanted to build London as the new Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the utopia in a way. And for Graham had the same kind of ideas. He quite often introduced kind of religious ideas, not religion in a churchy sense, but for example, the S-shaped curve, which is a curve of X against Y, which is S-shaped and has very special properties and comes all the way through fisheries research and all of population dynamics, nearly all of biology. He kind of mythologized it. It was a magic form, right? So his writing has mixed up these things. It wasn't religion as such, but he would make things like that, or the hyperbola or a parabola, as something very special, not just a curve of x squared against y or something. So that goes all the way through the Fish Gate. What he also did was to understand that the big issue was letting fish grow up. So, and become bigger. And if you catch too many of them when they're young, you don't get bigger ones later on. If you leave some to grow and you catch them before they all die of old age, then you'll get a higher catch, and you'll get a catch by working less. He was very interested in the fishermen leading a decent life and 5-day weeks, or that kind of thing as well. So he wanted high catch rates, as we call them. Okay. So he'd written all this. But he didn't have the mathematical way of thinking to be able to formulate it in a way that would convince the more scientific intellectual elite of the country. He'd been doing operational research in Normandy, and he was with a man named Hume, one of his colleagues in the Air Force, but they were attached to tanks at the Normandy landing, and they were both sitting on the turret of a tank, plotting the distribution of shells, and they were trying to work out the best way of aiming shells, because you got a random distributions, which were all quite new in those days. And so he's chatting to this mathematician sitting on the top of a tank tower and says, we've got a problem in fact. I used to work on fish, and what a problem is that fish die and they grow, and we need to know how best to catch fish. And his friend wrote out a differential equation on a blue envelope that the soldiers used to be given to send mail home. And he had one of these and gave this to Graham. So with a differential equation of population dynamics, and the man knew nothing about it, but for physicists, it was a very easy, it's a very simple sort of thing to do. So when I first went to Lowestoft to start work, first day I'm there, Michael Graham gives me this piece of paper. He said, this is the solution. This is how we're going to control regulate fisheries. And it was a differential equation and Hume had integrated it. I didn't know. I had not done any calculus, so I said, I don't understand that. I see what he's trying to do, but I don't know how to. So he said, well, you've got to go and learn mathematics then. So I went off and learnt mathematics. I spent my time in my first year, but all I had to do that. But tomorrow you're going to sea, and you're coming to sea with me. And that was a revelation. Here I am, the director of the laboratory. It's another, nearly as old as my dad. And I'm going off to sea with him, and I'm going to have to do the sort of things he does, and sew buttons onto live place, because we were marking place to see how long they lived and where they went. And there we were rocking around on this damned wooden ship, which had been built during the war as a minesweeper. But that was when I began to see this extraordinary man, an intellectual, a writer, an upper middle class, Quaker, landowner family, all this sort of thing, here mucking in with the fishermen and his young staff, and that was a very important experience. Because I was interested in politics, and he was, and not all the new young scientists who did recruited were where I spent. I talked to him quite a bit. Call me in, and we'd move from talking about what I was doing usually to also talking about general political issues. I don't mean party politics, but the state of the world, and about socialism and all these kinds of things. But he was also he was also a crackpot from the. It was an that's not fair. An eccentric, a typical classic English eccentric, and he had a house to the north of Lowestoft, and the lab was on the south of Lowestoft. So he had to go through the town. He used to come into town on a horse, into work on a horse, which was in itself was pretty unusual. But he wore a bowler hat, and that was also fairly unusual. But on his bowler hat, he had a red portside light and a green starboard side light. Now, that was weird, but it was safe, right? He was coming through the town on his horse. He had going back at night, and he had lights on his hat. And then the horse was moored next door to the laboratory. And when I started working with introduced to a man named Raymond Beverton, and we were told to work. We were going to work together, and he'd given us this piece of paper. And Ray Beverton didn't know any maths either, and he was going back to Cambridge to complete his studies. So I was left alone with this bit of paper. And teach yourself calculus, and the book I bought in the local bookshop, and staggered through integral calculus and started working away. And then Graham said, "You got 5 years to solve this and work it all out, because after 5, I can protect you for 5 years. After that, you're going to be thrown into the whirlpool of international diplomatic affairs, international commissions on regulations of European fisheries and things. And by that time, you've got to know what you're doing, and then we're going to go, and then you'll get involved into being an advisor and so on." So he gave us both 5 years. And we turned out we were a very good pair together, because I hated writing. I just wanted to get on with solving puzzles. And he was able not only to write very well, but he was capable of writing, say, a whole scientific paper and then throwing it away and starting again. I could never do that. If I wrote something, I'd then try and correct it, make a second draft on the first draft. He'd just throw it away and start again. So the result was, I think, a marvellous piece of writing, which is the book we published together a little later, but he did the writing, not me. I did most of the calculation and things in it. But, so it was a terrific partnership. It's called On the Dynamics of Exploited Fish Populations. And we finished it in must have been 90, when did I go? It was finished. We finished the research by end of 1949. We finished writing it by 1953. No, by 1951. I'd already left fisheries and gone on to doing terrestrial research with an organisation called the Nature Conservancy. But we went on working on this together with Ray Beverton, checking the calculations and doing most of the drafting. When it came to be published in the 50s, Her Majesty's Stationery Office started making a fuss. They'd set up, it's typeset, there was no digital reproduction then, and they said that they'd print 150 copies of it, and the director of the laboratory I've talked to you about, Michael Graham, said, well, if that's what you're going to do, I'm going to resign from being head of fisheries research in Britain. So there was a big argument about it. And in the end, they agreed to print, I think, 1,500 copies, and then that went quickly, and then it was reprinted again, and it's been reprinted 4 times since then, without any changes, except all the corrections that had to be put in for the mistakes I'd made in calculating and typos and all that stuff. So there we are, several hundred pages. It was treated as a textbook by a lot of people afterwards. But of course, it wasn't written as a textbook. It was written as advice on how to manage the southern Ocean, southern North Sea trawl fisheries. It wasn't written as a textbook, but it became one. I suppose there wasn't anything else. And it's full of graphs and stuff, and we calculated them all on this thing. This is a German Brunswiger calculating machine. Weighs about, I could hardly lift it now. Britain and the United States didn't make calculating machines at this time, but this was stolen from the Germans as war preparations, and they made a fantastic machine. This is not the original one. My son found on eBay that he could buy one, but then he got one which is absolutely identical with the one that Ray Beverton and I used until it broke down. And it's an amazing bit of machinery. I mean, 50 years later it still works. You need to turn the handle, you add things this way, and you subtract things this way, and you change decimal places by moving that thing along, and the answer comes up there to something like, I think, 15 decimal places. We had to work very precisely. So we did a huge amount of calculation. I mean, it would to calculate one simple graph might take several hours, sort of thing you could do in a fraction of a second on a modern laptop. I applied for several jobs while I was at Lowestoft and decided I really didn't like going to sea very much. And my wife didn't like Lowestoft, which is a pretty miserable town. She was a Londoner, teacher. It was all right, but it wasn't a great place to live. I mean, she liked Rome when we got there eventually, and really fitted in. Roger Revell, who had just been appointed director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego, California, came headhunting to Britain and went to see Lowestoft, to Lowestoft to see Graham, whom he knew. Scripps was a little institution at that time, and Roger Revell made it into one of the world's great oceanographic institutions, but he came to Lowestoft headhunting, and Michael Graham said, Sidney Holt doesn't want to go to sea much, or at least not on small fishing boats, and his wife is a bit footloose. So Roger Revell offered me a job at Scripps, which he was just building up, basically. And I said, fine, I'll have it. And I was going to have it all. And my wife, Judy, went out and bought herself a new suit. And this, and so we applied for a visa. But we were denied the visa because I'd been a member of the Communist Party while I was at university. And McCarthy was running things, right? So I couldn't take up the job at Scripps. And I was left trying to repay Roger Revell the money he'd lent me for the shipboard trip to get the job. And while I was trying to pay him back the loan, Britain devalued the pound from 4 to the dollar to 2 to the dollar. So suddenly I had sort of a year's pay to give. So in the end, Roger Revell wrote that off. And I later actually got to know Revell very well when I became an oceanographer working for UNESCO, and by then he was the big noise in the United States. But I had already, by then, been to the US. Oh, that's another story. Okay. Before Roger came to recruit me, there was a meeting, when would that have been? 1950, I think? It was a diplomatic conference in Washington to negotiate what became the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission. And Scottish fishing was going. Scottish boats were fishing over in the Newfoundland banks and over in George's Bank off the US coast at that time. So there was a heavy Scottish element there, but the English were in it as well. The establishments and research in England and Scotland are completely separate and competitive with each other, hating each other half the time. So I was put on the delegation as the scientific advisor because we'd done this stuff, and I went with, I was called the ferret on the delegation because I was the one who knew how to find things. Like, we went on the Queen Mary to the States, and I found out how to get from cabin class where we were to first class where the head of the delegation was. Through the engine room and the first-class galley, so we could go to the first-class cinema. And that was my sort of role until we got to the meeting, just running errands. So they called me the ferret. And that was an experience in going to America, right? And eating. For goodness sake, we still food rationing in England, and there was Queen Mary eating anything we wanted, It was a fantastic experience. But it was there that I began to, first I had to get a visa. That was my first effort to get on a visa, but this was to be on British delegation, a diplomatic delegation. It wasn't just an international meeting, it was a diplomatic conference. But still we had to have visas. There I came across what I knew in theory, but the reality of the special relationship between Britain and the United States, which included that the US State Department could vet the people that Britain put on international delegations, right? So that I had to be vetted, but I wasn't vetted by the State Department or the US intelligence. They entrusted MI5 and MI6 both to do the vetting. So Michael Graham, who knew my history and everything, he said, there's a couple of people coming up from London, from the Secret Service, and they're going to interrogate you. And they know all about you anyway, and they don't care damn that you're a member of the Communist Party. Just turn on, just talk to them, have tea with them. So these two came up, and they were like something out of Tintin. They were wearing pinstripe. They were up in the boondocks in Lowestoft, coming to this fishing port. They were still wearing pinstripe suits and bowler hats and carrying umbrellas and the Times under their arm. Absolute classic, So they march in and we have tea together in the director's office, and they start asking me questions about, well, why did you join the Communist Party? Well, I don't like this rotten capitalism. My father's unemployed and all this stuff. And they understood all this. So, well, okay, that's all right then. So you got your visa. We'll tell the Americans you're okay. And off they went back, and we had tea together, and Secretary brought in cakes, and Graham came in, and we chatted a bit about the politics of fishing regulation and stuff. And so that was my first introduction to international diplomacy, which meant, of course, I was very well prepared to go and work for the United Nations after this. But it was a fascinating meeting. It was actually a very important meeting in fisheries, the evolution of fisheries management, because we were thrown into this negotiation, which was mostly about haddock catching on George's Bank, and the Canadians, Americans were dominant, but the Europeans were still fishing over there a bit, including the Scots. And so we introduced, this was my first effort also at telling American and Canadian scientists who were on their delegations in Washington, talking to them in the evenings about what we'd been doing on population dynamics. So we jumped from doing these courses, the Europeans, to educating the North Americans. But there were so few people in the US, and in Canada particularly, who did understand this, because there were one or two people who had been doing this kind of thing in their own way for many years. So it was interesting to me, because I was meeting people who had been thinking about this but on different lines, but also because Graham himself had been in close contact, especially with the Canadians. There's a man named Bill Rico who was working there, is very well known, and some of the Americans too. They got onto this as he had in the 1930s. There were people of his generation who were doing quite interesting things. But they were a bit like him. They weren't that numeric, right? Rico was the nearest to it. He knew how to differentiate an algebraic equation, but he didn't know much more. He knew about as much as I did, really. But it was interesting to talk. So that was important, but also we were facing something different. In Europe, the real problem was, how can we limit the expansion of the fisheries? The British were saying, let's keep the fleets at no more than 60% of what they were before the war. That was convenient for the Brits, because they'd lost 40% of their fleet in the war, and they didn't want to build any more. And some of the other countries agreed, but a few, like the Danes, didn't. They were all into expansion, the way the Japanese were in the Pacific, which was affecting the North American people. But in the United States, we suddenly came to a situation where ideologically it was impossible to discuss the limitation of fishing, because this is a limitation of freedom. So you can't tell someone he can't go fishing. So everything was concentrated on just having a bigger mesh size in trawls and let the young fish out, but you couldn't actually grasp the thing. And that was sort of new to me. And it was the dominant theme in the negotiations in Washington of what became ICNAF, the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission. And after that, and even when I was in FAO, I was going to ICNAF meetings, and Ray Beverton and I went over and actually ran courses also in Canada and the US as well. But we were limited by the fact that the United States could not even discuss limitation of fishing efforts. So everything was, how can you change the fishing gear or something, or cut the season short, right? And they were in a situation where they were regulating halibut in the North Pacific. They couldn't limit the number of boats, so they limited the number of days you could go to sea, and in the end they had a halibut fishery with expensive boats that could only go to sea for 3 days a year. It was totally mad, but that's where it was, and it's taken a long time to get acceptance of the idea that maybe you shouldn't have that many boats. Now it's generally accepted, but it's still a big social political problem. So seeing that in NEAF was another exposure to a different world from the European diplomatic and bureaucratic world. So that was also in its way a kind of preparation for the even more different world of going to work in the UN and looking at the world as a whole and the third world and, an even bigger planet. And so we did that kind of thing. But the point was, and then I had to go and talk to what the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which we call the British ASS, and a sort of 19th century organisation, which was meeting in Liverpool. And that was important. I had to go. I went and talked to the scientists. Graham was also keen that we should get over what we were doing to the scientific community and not just the fisheries science community. And he had some connections there, so I had to go and talk to the scientific organisation, whereas we in Lowestoft, we talked to the fisheries people. So what Graham was basically saying was that while we were still working on that, I've given you 5 years, then you're going to get involved in advise in an intergovernmental organisation, but we won't be able to get anywhere if they all come with their young scientists who have no idea what you're talking about. So he got us to organise a training course in Lowestoft, bringing in all the young scientists from the Western European fishing countries, Denmark, France, etc. And we gave Raymond Beverton and I gave courses. Then after I left later on, I still went back. We did another one. So we had a young scientist in all the European countries who understood what we were talking about, and they could explain to their political people, their commissioners, what we were talking about. So I left Lowestoft after these few years, and we were still writing the book, and I got a job with the Nature Conservancy, a new organisation which was setting up nature reserves all over Britain, and I was posted to Edinburgh. And so I spent through, and I was married by then, and went to Edinburgh for 3 years, during which time we had two sons. And the director of the lab, there's another strange, again, one of these strange serendipitous events. The director is a man named John Berry, and he was a wildfowler. Well, at that time, everybody wanted to save wildlife. They were nearly all hunters, and reformed hunters. In fact, Peter Scott, who was one, and I got to know very well later on, and a man named Richard Fitter, but they wrote a book together called The Repentant Butchers, which was basically the new view of the elephants or whatever, tigers, conservation attitude towards them. But anyway, so John Berry, who was in charge of the Nature Conservancy in Scotland, was a wildfowler. And I was up there were only 2 of us in this new organisation. So I was setting on mostly. I didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to do with me. My being able to solve differential equations by then, and integrate and things, was not very relevant. So I had a motorbike. So John Barry said, go and see Scotland. So I spent a year doing nothing but driving my little BSA 125 bike around Scotland. I think we did 25,000 miles, going everywhere, looking at old Ordnance Survey maps, where the Ordnance Survey in the 19th century had shown remnant of Caledonian native forest, pine forest or something, seeing if it was still there, and whether it would be a good idea to make a nature reserve of it. So I spent that first year there, and then I thought I'd have to do some research. I started studying ants and trying to work out how much nectar ants collected and carried back to their nests. And so I spent, after going around on my motorbike for a year, I then spent another year camping out on the mountains, counting ants. I used to put dots of green paint on their backs as they left the nests, and then sit around waiting for them to come back and weighed them as they came back to see how much heavier they were when they were walking back, and spotting these things with little green pots of green paint on. So that was my research. basically camping in the pine woods of Scotland. And then I didn't know much about John Berry. All I knew is my director was away half the time. I'd been used to a director of research in Michael Graham who was there all the time, present all the time. And except when he was down in London, in Whitehall. And I never knew what he was doing. I presumed he was off doing his wildfowling. He was off in the White Wetlands somewhere in Aberdeenshire shooting ducks. It was only about 5 years ago someone sent me an obituary from the Scotsman saying John Berry had died. He had been head of the Nature Conservancy in Scotland. What he did? He was a spy. And that was why he was away. He worked for both MI5 and MI6. He was the man who met Rudolf Hess when Hess flew from Germany to Scotland to ask the Brits to stop fighting them and help them fight the Russians and try to get a separate peace. And Berry was the man who went and interrogated Hess. So he was my boss here running the Nature Conservancy. He was never there. I thought he was out shooting ducks and he was doing his spy thing. So that was quite a revelation, but I didn't know anything about that at the time, so I hardly ever saw him. So there's a lot of weird people around, in the conservation movement. But in doing the bit talking to the real scientists in Liverpool, I met Jeffrey Kesterman, who was working with the Food and Agriculture Organisation, FAO, of the UN. He had spent his time writing a book on fisheries science, and I gave him the manuscript of what Ray and I had written, and he read it during the meeting of the British Ass in Lowestoft. And he threw away his manuscript of his own book and said, I'm wasting my time. You've done what is really needed, right? He had been writing kind of a long essay. And it was very good. It got a lot of interesting things. He said, forget it then. He threw his own book away. And then after a little later than that, he wrote a letter to me from Rome, the headquarters of FAO, and said, would you come and teach at a training course that we're giving in Turkey? And so I told him about these courses we were running for the Europeans, and he'd gone back to FAO. So we need this kind of thing also in the third world and the Mediterranean and so on, and asked me to if I'd go for 6 weeks and teach in this training course in Istanbul. And at that time, I was working for the Nature Conservancy. Although I was in Edinburgh, any letter addressed to me went to the Nature Conservancy headquarters in London, and they opened all the letters. So I got this personal letter already opened, and with it was pinned on a note from the Director General of the Nature Conservancy saying, I see you're looking for another job. If you're really going to do this, then just tell us and go. But if you want to work with the Nature Conservancy, stop looking for another job. I thought, damn, this. Got this, and by that time, I'd just moved from Edinburgh to the Lake District, but still with the Nature Conservancy, but I was now in the Nature Conservancy, England. And I thought, to hell with this. And so I resigned. I had a permanent civil service job and a wife with 2 young children who were both, one was 1 year old, one was 2. And we had no money. I mean, my salary, I think, was $250 a year then, or something like that. It was like that, And we were totally broke. But I resigned. I was that impetuous, you see. Stupid, one might say, really. I'd given up a pensionable civil service job. So I go to Istanbul. Judy, my wife, said, yeah, okay, go on. Do we do what we have to do? And so I went and did this thing for 6 weeks in Istanbul. That was an experience, and saw Rome, and that was an experience. And went back to the Lake District, and this was, I think, late November. And then 3 days before Christmas, I got a phone call from him, from Kesterman, who was running what we call the biology branch of the fisheries division of FAO. He said, "Do you want a job? Come and work with us." Yeah, I'm unemployed right now. I resigned to go to 6 weeks to Turkey. And he said, "Right, if you can get here by the 31st of December, you've got a job." Because they were working on an annual budget, and they wouldn't have the budget for me to be given a job and move if it was after the 31st of December. So, well, it's the 21st of December now, Christmas. So my wife and I and 2 kids packed up, left, went to London, spent Christmas in London, and flew out to Rome on the 31st of December. That's how I got involved with the United Nations. And it was a sort of 2-year job, and then later it turned into 5 years, then later it turned into indefinite, permanent, not permanent in UN, but indefinite. So it was Kesterman that got me involved in that sort of thing. And there was also then I then spent the next years having as big arguments with him as I'd had with Michael Graham while I was in Lowestoft. In the end, he said, "I'm going to go home to Australia," after I'd been in Rome with him about 5 years. "And I want to go home, and I'm going to propose you be appointed as chief of the biology branch." And I said, "I don't want that. I'm interested in going on doing my work." I was able in those days to actually continue almost research on population dynamics while I was working in FAO, as well as running training courses that we were doing and so on. And I didn't want that, and I fought against it for several months. But then he convinced me by saying, "If you don't take the job, they'll appoint someone you don't like. And you'll find yourself here under someone you don't respect, so you better just do it." So, all right. So I was appointed head of biology branch, which was about 6 scientists at that time, working on fisheries resources, whereas the rest of FAO was working on operations, on gear development, on the economics, marketing, all these things. So we had a little group of scientists there. And I recruited it was a time when we actually had quite a lot of money in the UN, and I was able to recruit my friends, several of them, whom I taught in the first courses in Lowestoft, brought them to come and work with me in Rome. So we had a really nice, tight little group of scientists. I mean, they couldn't all be Europeans. I did have an American and someone from Southeast Asia and so on, but based on Europe. Australia and Canada were fairly important by then in fisheries research. But my problem was, to get a doctorate of science, you get it on the basis of what you've published, and what I'd published was that book. And I was a co-author of it with Raymond Beverton, so we had to decide which bit I wrote and which bit he wrote, which we'd sworn we would never, ever do. But anyway, we agreed I'd done most of this bit and that bit. I'd done the basic theory, whereas he'd written the applications. And so I got my doctorate at Reading, and that was all right. But I didn't get that till late 50s, I think it was, 59, something like that. I was already then working in Rome in the Food and Agriculture Organisation. Although I was in fisheries, I was already involved in whaling as from 1960, because my director of the original fisheries division, Donald Finn, a Canadian scientist who was director of the whole division, had been going to whaling commission meetings, because he went to quite a lot of international meetings to follow them, and this one was important. And in 1959, when Norway and Netherlands had left the International Whaling Commission, there was a huge crisis because they'd not been able to reduce catches to so-called sustainable levels, and it was a political crisis. And the British proposed that, and it was partly because there was no science in it. they had a catch quota measured in what's called blue whale units, an equivalent number of blue whales for 4 different species of whales. And the number was 16,000, and that number had got like that. I mean, they decided in 1946, they said, what shall we make it? 20,000 blue whale units? No, 5,000 blue whale. No. That was how it was decided. 16 blue whale units. That was the catch quota for the Antarctic factory ship whaling. And we couldn't, and the scientists in the commission before I got involved in it hadn't been able to change that. They kept saying it's much too high, but none of them were numerate. It was like the people we'd seen in Europe who were good biologists, but they didn't know how to count and do simple mathematics. I mean, my mathematics looks very complicated, but it's actually extremely simple. It's sort of, it's high school calculus. There's nothing great about it, but most biologists didn't know that, any of that. So, and the whale scientists were the same. They were studying things. They were going out on whaling ships and looking inside whale stomachs, all that kind of thing. But they didn't know how to count or calculate a sustainable yield. So the Brits said, let's have an independent scientific group. We proposed that we appoint 3 scientists who are not from whaling countries, but who are fisheries people who know how to do this kind of calculations. And my boss, Dom Finn, offered me. Now, I didn't really qualify as one of the 3. I didn't really qualify because I was British, and Britain was the biggest whaling country at that time, at least as big as Norway and Japan and so on. And but because I worked for the United Nations, I got trying to neutralise, so that was all right. And I'd been one of the people with Beverton who kind of invented this sort of thing. The other 2 people, one was an American mathematician, Douglas Chapman, who's professor of maths at the University of Washington in Seattle. And he was one of the few in population dynamics then. He'd been working on fur seals in the Barents Sea and Pribilofs. So he was another one. And another one was K.R. Allen, a New Zealander who was resident in Canada at the time. And he knew a bit about it. He'd done stuff on freshwater fishes, but he was numerate, right? So the 3 of us were appointed in 1960. Japanese didn't like this, but they had to go along with it. And they had to make an agreement, however, that the commission, the Whaling Commission, would adopt whatever we said by 1964. That was in 1960, we were appointed. And so they agreed reluctantly. The Americans were not that happy. They really wanted the commission to be self-sufficient. They didn't much like the idea of bringing in people from outside, but that was negotiated and acceptable, and the 3 of us started work. We should have started in 1960. We didn't actually start till beginning of 1962. Why? Because the commission couldn't agree on, I think the total budget, I think, was $1,500 to pay the fare for me and Kay Allen to go to Seattle and work for a week with Chapman to work out what the hell we were going to do. And they couldn't agree on that budget because the big argument was, should it be paid by the 5 whaling countries, Norway, Japan, Russia, Netherlands and Britain, or by all the members of the Whaling Commission? Because they couldn't agree, they couldn't find $1,500. So we started work in beginning of 60. Almost immediately, we had suddenly access to all the data that the Whaling Commission had ever collected. It was a very, very big database. And we 3 of us knew how to deal with this, and we actually had to invent some new methods because the whales are a bit different from fish, and they're a bit different from Pribilof seals, but still. So we invented new methods, and we did the analysis, and we produced an interim report before the end of the year saying, you may think you've got to reduce the quota a bit, but you've got to cut it dramatically, right? Not 16,000 cutting to 15 or 14,000. You've got to cut it down to 4,000, which was, absolutely untenable as far as the whalers were concerned, at least most of the whalers, and especially the Japanese and the Russians. The Russians were building at that time a whole new fleet of huge factory ships. And the Japanese were just converting, they didn't build new ones, they converted old vessels into factories. And they were building 6 ships and 4 big, huge Russian ones coming. Here they were having made huge investments in Antarctic whaling, and we were saying, you've got to cut the catch to a quarter of what it was to be sustainable. So that was really hard going. By the time we got to 1963, the Japanese delegation was saying, I'm sorry, we might have said we'd go along with this in 1960, but we can't be held to what we said in 1960. We can't do all this. Meanwhile, friends that we knew, I knew very well, a man named Peter Purvis, who worked in the Natural History Museum in Britain, had been looking at the earplugs in the ears, wax earplugs in the ears of whalebone whales, with the rings in which, like tree rings, tell you how old they are. And that was the basis of the sort of thing. You know, in fisheries, you look at scales, and you also look at ear stones in ears called otoliths with rings on, and these earplugs in whales also tell you. The only thing was that the theory was that there were 2 rings laid down each year as the whales migrated to and from the tropics and the Antarctic, which the baleen whales were all doing. And suddenly you Peter Purvis found they were only laying down 1 ring a year. That meant the whales were twice as old as we thought they were. So before we'd got to 1964, we'd had to say, sorry, wasn't 4,000, you've got to go down to 2,000. And you can imagine the consternation this caused. So that was my introduction to the whaling issue. Oceanography was beginning to be important. It was oceanographers that exposed plate tectonics, so we knew that how continents moved about, and all this was coming out of oceanography, as well as El Nino and the big effect of the big currents and all this stuff, sort of thing that Ravel in Scripps was supporting, and Woods Hole and the Russians too were doing a lot of this. And there was a big movement among the oceanographers that we wanted to raise our status and have a world organisation, because by then it was clear that oceanographic research needed to be global, and it was bigger than any single country could do. It was more difficult than going into space. You could go into space from Cape Canaveral, but to oceanography, you had to go everywhere, and that meant American and Russian, especially American and Russian cooperation. And there was also a movement in the United States and other countries to change government structures so that everything to do with the sea was brought into a single piece of government instead of being spread around Ministry of Food, Science, all this sort of thing. Big effort there. And I got involved in that one way and another. When I was first in FAO, because we found we had to start cooperating with UNESCO, that has set up a marine science division, UN, which was getting involved more and more into the law of the sea, International Atomic Energy Agency that was involved in the disposal of nuclear waste at sea, WHO that was involved in, WMO, because the oceans were suddenly realised that the oceans control the climate, basically, and even WHO, World Health Organization, that was worried about pollution and things. So I was interested in this, so I opted to go to work in UNESCO in Paris and passed the division over to a Portuguese colleague that I'd recruited, Mario Ruivo. That was 1969, 70, 71, when the UN launched the preparation for what was to be a huge conference in Stockholm in June 1972, the UN Conference on the Human Environment, which is the first environmental conference after the San Francisco one that Michael Graham addressed in 1947, which was about, also a bit about, but it wasn't about environmentalism, it was about how you manage resources, right? So here was this big thing going. And meanwhile, I got involved with people in Malta who were behind the launch of the Law of the Sea conference, which eventually was started to get a new Law of the Sea thing. And I knew these people, I wasn't actually working with it. But the idea was put to FAO. I was still employed by FAO and finishing my term in UNESCO. So I was appointed as the United Nations person, UN proper, to be the liaison officer for marine affairs in the Mediterranean. And I was based in Malta. And I was made in order to be there and have a position as well, I was appointed as a professor in the University of Malta, and I started an organisation called the International Oceanographic Institute, and that was all done under UN auspices, unofficially, but UN really. So I was there in Malta in 1972 when the Stockholm Conference on Human Environment was held. So because I worked for the UN, I was appointed to the Secretariat of the Stockholm Conference. They were taking a few people out, bringing, about 20 people together in Stockholm to organise the conference. And I didn't do much organisation in the secretarial sense, but I was a liaison person, and I knew something about the sea. And it was there, of course, although I'd been involved in whaling issues, it was there I encountered the move by the United States to have a moratorium on whaling. So I got involved in that while I was there. I did more than I should have done, because by then I really, really wanted whaling to be regulated. And I was very suspicious that the whaling industry would ever agree to a proper regulation. So I was I heard about this moratorium proposal, 10-year pause in whaling while we get our act together from the US. And that sort of interested me. So I got involved while I was in Stockholm for a few weeks in helping to get through the US proposal for a moratorium. To my credit, I got Norway to vote for it, because a good friend of mine had worked in FAO. This is the way it works, I suppose. And Gunnar Zettersdal, a marvellous person and a marvellous, very good scientist, who was the scientific advisor to the Norwegian delegation. And we told him, Norway's got to support this. The whaling business is a mess. Don't think this is fishing. This is something else. So Norway voted to it. Of course, they soon backed down from it later, but there they were. So that was that was another problem where this was about my third encounter, that I got on the wrong side of Japanese delegation, because a woman named, Project Joan McIntyre, an American woman dressed like a real hippie, called me up in Stockholm. I didn't know her. I said, I'd like to talk to you about this whaling moratorium thing. Had breakfast together over in the UN building. So there's this woman all dressed in beads and long skirts and stuff. And we talked, and turned out she had been part of the discussion in the non-governmental organisations to get the US to propose a moratorium, although it was much more than that. There were some big noises involved in getting this. But anyway, she wanted to talk to me. She started an organisation called Project Jonah, and she wrote a marvellous book called Mind in the Waters, which was an anthology of things that have been written, poetry, music and things about whales. And it's a wonderful book, collection. I was introduced there to this different view of what whales are about, right? Mind in the waters. And it was, you know, it was very good. Some of it a bit overboard, you know, they've got big brains, they must be more intelligent than us, this sort of thing. But I was introduced to all this. But having breakfast in the room, I was seen by the Japanese delegation. Remember, they'd already got their eyes on me from the African stuff, the Whaling Commission stuff in the 60s. Here I was having breakfast with this radical terrorist, practically, right? So they reported me to that day. This is how personally they reported me that day to the Director General of FAO, who was my boss because I was still employed by FAO, even though I was actually appointed there by the Secretary General of the UN. I mean, I was fairly senior. I was a director, so it was the Secretary General that appointed me this. And here's the Japanese delegation writing back saying, remove this man from here. He's been seen having breakfast with a terrorist. But I survived that. The Director General called me up and said, what's all this? I had a load of nonsense, the usual thing, you know. Oh, forget it. I took no notice. I didn't even answer. But I saw their messages they were sending back, went through the Japanese embassy in Rome and taken over by messenger to the Director General. This is terrorist here. But as a result of Stockholm, UN set up the UN Environment Programme and said one of the things we've got to do is look at marine mammals. So they gave FAO a lot of money to employ me to run a marine mammal program, looking in, trying to the status of marine mammals in the world. So from 1973 through to practically the end of the 70s, I ran the marine mammal program, sitting in Rome in the Department of Fisheries without a line responsibility, but with a lot of money to work almost freely. I was setting up working groups of specialists on dugongs, on dolphins and things like that. I've got about 400 people involved. And this is when the Whaling Commission was having to look at the moratorium issue, but the whalers in most countries were trying to get out of that. And they managed to get out of it in the end by a proposal from Australia, which was written by Kay Allen, who'd been one of the Committee of Three, the one who'd been working in Canada and had gone to New Zealand, had gone back to Australia. And he produced a proposal which was a true compromise, which said if a population of whales is reduced below a certain point, roughly half its original number, then whaling stops. You don't calculate sustainable yields, it stops. But if there's still more than half of them left, then you calculate quotas in a certain way. And it was pretty conservative, and we were worried about uncertainty and precaution. We didn't do it very well, but it was the best that could be done at that time. So throughout the 70s, from 74 onwards, there was this thing called the new management procedure, which the Whaling Commission developed, and all we Committee of Three were in it. Alan on the Australian delegation had proposed it. Douglas Chapman was chairman of the scientific committee of the IWC by then, and I was representing UNEP. So the three of us were working together in this new context of what was called the amended moratorium, the big compromise. So really I was doing two things throughout the 70s. Producing the FAO UNEP, the UN program on marine mammals, and organising these meetings and writing reports and all this, but going to Whaling Commission meetings and working on the science of applying Kay Allen's new management procedure, as we call it. So doing those two things nearly all through the 70s. And then 2 years later, I was invited to a meeting in a conference, a gathering in 1974 in Bloomington, Indiana, organised by a young student at the University of Indiana called John Goodman, who happened to have links everywhere. He was young, he was about 20 years old, I think, but he knew musicians and painters and sculptors and so on. He brought together this huge crowd of people from all kinds, scientists, political people, sculptors, writers, musicians, a fantastic gathering of people. And I was sort of suddenly, I was being faced with another view of what Wales was about. And Roger Payne was there, who discovered that humpback whales sing, and that southern right whales know how to sail with their fins, flukes in the air. He did all these things. So there's all these people here who are quite serious people about but different aspects of Wales. Now, it had started by my being called while I was in transit, actually, in New York, going on my way to a fisheries meeting in Japan, called by someone from Princeton University, Princeton University, get off the plane in transit and come down here and listen to a record. Anyway, I'm on my way to Tokyo. And I said, hey, you've got 3 hours here, go, take you down to Princeton. And he made me sit and listen to Roger Payne's first recording of the humpback whale singing. So I'd been introduced to another way of looking at whales, of studying whales, and so on. Far cry from from population dynamics and the IWCs, the science I've been doing. So I've been kind of inoculated with that. Then went to 74 to this fantastic gathering. And from then onwards, it seemed to me, it took a while to get round to this, but it seemed to me the thing to do is to stop whaling, not regulate it. It took years to finally get this. And it was also something, in my position, you couldn't really say aloud very much. You'd just be dismissed as a crank. You still tried to do conservation and regulate it. But we knew that if we got regulations to what they really needed to be, whaling was going to become uneconomic anyway. That was the key to it, through conservation. And you'd be honest about it. The situation was so bad that if you actually got it reduced to what it would be sustainable, it wouldn't be worth going to the Antarctic to kill whales. That was it. So since I was interested in politics and economics and things, and was a Marxist and thinking all the time about costs and benefits and so all these sorts of things. So through the 70s, that change was beginning to happen until I retired with a bang of glory in 1978 and started taking my pension. And then my second life started, and I had another career from then on.